Story 1. It's a widely accepted fact that the mining industry contains some of the more perilous jobs in the career pool. It pays ludicrously well, of course, but has a notably higher mortality chance to salary ratio when compared to other blue-collar work. It's certainly understandable. However, from poor air quality to cave-ins, all the way to hidden gas pockets and equipment failure, there's plenty of things in this line of work that are less than accommodating to human life. At the absolute very least, however, these risks are expected. Those that work in the field not only anticipate these risks, but gladly accept them as such when venturing below the surface. Aside from freak accidents, things usually only go wrong in semi-well documented ways. With that in mind, allow me to paint a picture. Something went wrong, and 4 individuals from a 12-man crew have now perished. The rest are stranded, with no foreseeable way to the surface. And yet none of the previously mentioned risks are to blame. In fact, the mine itself, or anything naturally forming for that matter, isn't to blame either. So with all of those potential hazards ruled out, for what reason could this have occurred? Whatever you guessed is likely far from reality, likely not even remotely close. The situation makes absolutely no sense, and the explanation will make even less. For that reason, I'll attempt to break everything down as simply as possible from the beginning, but bear with me as certain parts might be rather long-winded. To start, I'm Finnegan. I'm an equipment operator for a coal mining operation run by Riker Energy Resources, a rather newly founded company headquartered in Wyoming. Overall, the job was a phenomenal opportunity. Little to no experience was needed due to the company being notably unestablished in the industry, with the compensation structure only falling slightly below the national average. For someone fresh out of high school with no plans for college, it was an opportunity too perfect to pass up. After 2 years with the company, I'd gotten into the rhythm of doing my job, and did it particularly well, factoring in the generally unchanging crew of 11 other individuals I worked with. We overall functioned like a well-oiled machine. We pride ourselves on that ability to work efficiently, yet we were rather dependent on our routine. However, at the beginning of our shift approximately 12 hours ago, that routine was broken, and as if the forces of the universe took notice of this, everything went sideways in very short order. Thought we were on waste removal for the week? I questioned, flipping through the thoroughly stained schedule taped to the window of the managerial office. Y'all lucked out this time. Survey team discovered a sizable load deeper down. Got no extra crews to work on it, so y'all are up for now. Our foreman stated, reviewing the paper himself before retrieving and unfolding an additional piece of paper from his pocket. Looks like all of y'all are set to be on shift. I'd just wait by the truck for everyone else to show up, he added, gesturing to the vehicle. I simply nodded and walked over to the truck, leaning on it as I sipped the mug of bitter coffee I'd hurriedly brewed before arriving. Rather promptly, the other 11 members of our worker pool arrived, and we quickly filed into the back of the vehicle. It was little more than an industrial tour bus, and the crew compartment was notably cramped with 12 individuals packed inside. I was seated in the very back row, and a large bearded individual by the name of Angus filled the seat beside me. New plans? Certainly beats shoveling rock for another 12 hours. Aye, he commented with a slight chuckle. His accent was thickly Scottish, as were most of his mannerisms. Still gonna be shoveling rock, bud. At the very least we get to use the fun tools as well, Margot responded from the middle row. She was likewise an equipment operator, so we often worked interchangeably on the same tasks. Likewise, being the second oldest member of the crew at 55 years old, she was well respected by everyone else. Before anyone else was able to join in, the personnel carrier jolted to life as it began shakily moving down into the depths of the mines. Despite being rather large, all equipment was electrically operated to reduce the risk of fumes accumulating, and as a result it began picking up speed impressively quickly. Despite our assignment being roughly 500 feet below the surface through various crowded and winding shafts, we were expected to arrive in around 10 minutes. Around 5 minutes into the ride, Angus tapped me on the shoulder and motioned to my coffee mug. which had since become rather cold. "Gonna finish that?" "Finn?" he politely questioned. "Have at it. Not the most pleasant brew," I responded, handing him the half-full mug. "Thanks, lad," he replied, finishing the remaining beverage alarmingly quickly. Shortly thereafter, the vehicle jolted to a halt as we arrived at the assignment site. It was a dead-end cavern with quickly assembled support beams and lighting systems, giving it the definitive appearance of a work in progress. We exited the vehicle and quickly began divvying up the work as always did at the start of a larger task. A gruff, older individual that we simply referred to as Davy took the lead as per usual. He was the oldest individual on the crew, at an astonishing 60 years of age, and had plenty of experience in the industry to back his leadership. After the majority of the crew had been assigned their respective tasks, he pointed in my direction and provided me with my job for the shift as well. "Finn, Margot, grab the drills and hit those markers. Depth should be marked below," he ordered, gesturing to various chalk markings on the nearby cavern wall. "Mark, get with Angus and start prepping some charges." "All right, let's have a good day. Break," he added, before clapping his hands. Everyone broke out and began working as instructed, with Margot and I making our way across the cavern towards a line of parked utility trucks with various types of equipment stacked in the back. We grabbed the large handheld drills we were to be using during the shift and lugged them over to the specified wall, powering them up and beginning our task as instructed. Within around an hour, many of the markings had been drilled down to their identified depths, with the remaining being completed 20 minutes thereafter. Angus began filling the completed holes with charges, with all the remaining crew filing into their respective vehicles as we began exiting the potential blast radius. Angus arrived last and revealed a detonator from his pocket, connected to the charges with a sizable length of wire. "Shall I do the honors, boss?" Angus questioned, removing the protective cover from over the switch. Davy consulted his radio, and after receiving the all clear, responded with a simple thumbs up. Angus flipped the switch as a thundering explosion echoed through the cavern, with the shockwave shortly making its way up with a level of force that shook the vehicles parked beside us. After a few moments, we loaded back into the trucks and once more returned to the site, which now had a sizable hole blown into the cavern wall, revealing a notably large amount of coal winding throughout the inside of the stone. We began surveying the area and once more began our assigned duties. Margot and I retrieved our drills and made our way over to the wall to continue the extraction process. However, before we could make much progress, Margot stopped and placed her drill on the ground. "Something wrong?" I questioned, doing the same. She appeared fixated on a particular section of the wall, one that was visibly lighter colored than the rest of the nearby stone. "Not sure if I'm seeing things, but I think that's concrete," she responded, picking up a nearby hammer and further chipping away at the area. After a few heavy swings, a larger chunk broke off the wall, revealing visible rebar underneath. "Well, I'll be damned. Davy, check this out," she added, calling Davy over as she continued removing the area surrounding the rebar. Davy arrived and appeared just as astonished at the sight. He retrieved a piece of paper from his jacket, referencing it as he continued glancing at the opening. "Shouldn't be anything man-made here. The company has just barely started excavating at this depth," he stated, removing a few additional pieces with his hand. "Shouldn't even be anything aside from the mine for the surrounding 10 miles, he added. He radioed back up to the surface, and after a brief conversation, returned looking visibly more confused than he was previously. "Looks like it's a new development to management as well. If it seems sound enough, they suggested that we either drill around it or through it," he informed us, once more glancing at the opening as he referenced his documents. "Why not just set a charge in that spot? Should give us an idea of how deep it goes, and we might still stay on schedule too," Mark suggested, having likewise taken notice of the discovery along with overhearing the conversation. He was relatively new on the crew, having only been there for a few months, along with being just 4 years older than I at 25, but had proven his efficacy enough to warrant a reasonable say in matters. Davy contemplated it for a moment before shrugging and walking off. "Don't see why not. Grab Angus and let me know when it's ready," he responded. After drilling a sizable pocket to place the charge in, and hammering around additional layers of rebar, the charge was set, and everyone once more drove to a safe distance. As before, Angus received the green light and detonated it, with the thunderous crack of the material splitting echoing throughout the cavern. We returned to the site, and with all members of the crew now being aware of the strange anomaly, everyone crowded around the opening as the dust began to fully settle. To our immense surprise, the explosion didn't reveal additional layers of concrete, or even normal stone on the other side, but rather an opening into what appeared to be another cavern. Margot, having retrieved a lamp from one of the trucks, powered it on and shined it in the hole, only to reveal something even stranger. It was a warehouse, a sizable one at that, with various wooden crates and shelves that extended well beyond the reach of the lamp's light. "Now just what in the fuck did we come across here?" Angus asked, approaching the opening. He motioned for Margot to hand him the lamp, and after retrieving it, stepped inside the opening, which was barely a foot above ground level. He shined the light around, revealing a ceiling of at least 20 feet in height, and even more rows of shelves and crates extending through the room. Soon thereafter, another 4 of us grabbed a lamp as well and followed. Entering the strange room, everything was covered in a noticeably thick layer of dust, the type that only accumulates after years upon years of abandonment. The air was visibly polluted with it, and after walking roughly 100 feet deeper, we were forced to turn back due to the relatively unbreathable nature of the environment. However, before returning, our lamps were able to vaguely illuminate a door at the other end of the storage room. It was made of solid metal and had one of those wheel-like mechanisms for opening it, something one might find inside a ship. Davy, being practically asthmatic after venturing inside, gestured to the nearest workers. "Grab some respirators from the truck. I'd rather figure out what this is before we blow anything else to pieces," he ordered. The workers nodded and returned carrying a crate of them, with Davy distributing them out to each of the crew members before pointing to the opening. "Need 5 people to check it out with me. It's not a sightseeing tour. We're detailing every last thing we find, and then heading back out to continue our work. Regardless, everyone mask up while the ventilation system does its job," he stated. I, being rather intrigued, immediately volunteered, as did Angus, Margot, Mark, and a rather newer individual by the name of Al. Once everyone had donned their gear, we once more entered the opening and began venturing to the other side. The many crates we passed along the way were mostly unmarked, with some having labels that had become far too faded to perceive the information printed on them. While looking at the crates, I failed to notice that Mark had paused directly in front of me, and as a result, I nearly took both of us to the ground by accident. "Shit! My fault, man. All good?" I asked, regaining my footing. He briefly scanned the left side of the room through the scaffold shelving before responding. "No worries. Could have sworn I saw some shit moving around, is all," he replied, seeming marginally uneasy. Angus briefly turned around and joined in as well before continuing onward. "Probably just a rat. Lol. Might even be a raccoon. Perhaps even the boogeyman," he added with a chuckle. "No way in hell a raccoon's all the way down here. Doubt even a rat would bother, Al included." "It seems that only leaves the boogeyman then," Angus responded, releasing a hearty laugh. The conversation was abruptly cut short by a loud creaking further ahead. Davy had reached the door at the other end and was attempting to open it to little avail. "Mind cutting the banter and lending me a hand?" he asked, annoyance clear in his voice. Angus rushed over, and upon likewise grabbing the wheel, managed to begin successfully turning it. It released an ear-splitting grinding noise, clearly indicative of the amount of time that had passed since it was last opened. Eventually it fully came loose. As the door slowly creaked open, the rest of us rushed over, and upon shining our lights through the doorway, discovered that the discovery was likely far more sizable than we originally anticipated. A hallway extended to both the left and right of the doorway, with more doors and what appeared to be a mess hall at the furthest left end. 2 other hallways extended from the main WS as well, both leading further into the structure. Older fluorescent lights lined the ceiling, but considering the clear age of the structure, chances of them working were evidently negligible. Should we, split up? Or are we just going to search this place one room at a time? Mark questioned. Davy considered it for a moment before responding. I'd rather leave it to the survey crew to fully map this place. Check what you can and reconvene here in 20. Yeah, he replied. Everyone nodded. As we began splitting up to check the structure, I went towards the mess hall as Angus began attempting to open the nearest door while everyone else went in their own directions. I reached the mess hall fairly quickly and discovered 4 rows of lunchroom-style tables with a large box television mounted on the wall. A counter extended on the furthest wall, leading into what appeared to be a kitchen. I hopped the counter, knocking over a metal tray which hit the ground with an echoing crash. Margot, being nearby, called over. Everything all right over there? Finn, she asked. Having spooked myself to some degree, I composed myself before responding. All good. Just being clumsy is all, I replied. I made my way throughout the rather sizable industrial kitchen, coming across various canned goods and cookware. Another door seemingly led out of the kitchen, but upon attempting to open it, I quickly concluded that it was locked. The most striking aspect of the kitchen, however, was the seemingly used appearance of it, not in the sense that it had been recently used, but rather used at some point. Multiple pots were found within a large sink basin, with the mold growing within, suggesting that they hadn't been unused when placed inside. Even some of the counters had visible residue underneath the profoundly thick layer of dust. Eventually, I glanced at my watch and realized that around 15 minutes had passed. I once more hopped the counter, this time being mindful of the remaining trays sitting on its surface. Before I could make my way into the hallway, however, I picked up a distinct sound from inside the kitchen, particularly the sound of something small, such as a metal utensil, clattering against the ground. I quickly shined my lamp back over the counter and was met with a rather unnerving sight. A small pair of eyes was looking back at me, not in some overly unnatural sense, but rather something comparable to the eyes of an animal at night, just 2 dimly reflective, almost shimmering dots. I frowned and kept my light on the eyes. They were small enough to fit the profile of a medium-sized rodent, but the more alarming aspect was how they seemed directly behind the counter, yet still cleared the top of it. The counter, being around 3.5 feet off the ground, made this especially concerning. I slowly backed away, keeping my light on the strange set of eyes, as they remained unmoving and aimed in my direction. Once I was back in the hall, I quickened my pace and eventually made it back to the door we had entered in, where Margot and Davy were waiting. Davy was flipping through a dusty folder of papers he had evidently discovered, while Margot was reviewing a binder she had likewise come across as well. Glad to see you made it back. Find anything? Margot questioned. Not really. Found a kitchen and a locked door. Nothing of much substance, I replied, pausing for a moment. I considered trying to explain the small creature that was evidently in the kitchen with me, but eventually settled with a more rational explanation. There was also a big-ass rat or something in there. Kind of freaked me out, I added. Davy briefly looked up from his papers, before returning to them once more. Place must be infested then. Came across a good few of them in the offices I found. Would be lying if I said they didn't spook me as well, he added. Margot was seemingly about to add something as well, before Angus and Mark likewise arrived. Both were empty-handed, but Mark was clearly rather shaken up. Anything interesting? Davy questioned, still flipping through the stack of papers. Found another storage room with even more boxes. This lad walked right into a rat nest and nearly shat his britches, he added, lightly elbowing Mark on the shoulder. He seemed rather annoyed, but likewise joined in as well. Shined my light into a hallway and caught the eyes of about a dozen of the rodents. Looked like some shit straight out of a horror flick, he added. As he finished, A loud crash once more echoed through the kitchen at the other end of the hall. We each shined our lamps in that direction, only to be met by none other than the same eyes as before peeking around the corner. With the profound amount of dust in the air throughout the facility, it was still impossible to make out a definitive form to the animal. But the eyes were clearly a foot above the ground. We remained silent for a moment, as us and the animal stared each other down. Eventually, the silence was broken by my watch alarm going off, signifying that the 20 minutes was up. The animal scurried away, making an audible noise while doing so, as we all composed ourselves once more. "Spooky little bastards," Angus commented, looking down the other end of the hall. "Say, have you lads seen Al around here?" he added. We looked around, likewise taking notice of his absence. He had gone down the hallway at the furthest end, and with each of us having a timekeeping device of some sort, it was more than expected that we would be back at the end of those 20 minutes. Davy seemed rather frustrated, and placed the stack of papers in his jacket as he walked over to the entrance of the hall. He called out multiple times to no response, and eventually started returning as his lamp began to visibly dim and flicker. Once back with the group, he removed and replaced the battery to no avail. As the lamp proceeded to fully extinguish itself, he shook his head before addressing the group. "Nothing but more rats and more dust, and I'm sure as hell not about to go down there with this piece of shit," he added, hitting the defunct lamp. I'll go get the lad," Angus commented, as he made his way towards the hall. He eventually disappeared around the corner as the echoing sound of his footsteps gradually faded, eventually becoming inaudible. Davy gestured towards Margot's lamp, which she handed to him. "You three head back. I'll wait for them," he stated, shining the light down the hall. "Radio doesn't seem to be working all that well here. Get a unit at site and relay your findings to surface until we get back," he added. We simply nodded in unison and began making our way back through the warehouse. The atmosphere had noticeably shifted, and unease was becoming evident in each of our mannerisms. While I kept my light aimed straight ahead, Mark was shining his to either side, clearly still on edge due to his encounter within the facility. Margot, not having a lamp anymore, stayed close by at the front of the group, eventually breaking the silence. "Say, do y'all really think those are rats?" she questioned. Mark caught up with the group before joining in as well. "I'd like to think so. Why'd you ask?" he responded. Margot seemed to gather her thoughts for a moment before answering his question. "I found this small office, and a couple were in there. All I could see was their eyes peeking from behind a desk," she responded. "Same with my encounter. Pretty damn creepy," Mark interjected. Margot once more seemed to collect her thoughts before replying. "Well, it's just..." She paused a moment before continuing. "As I left the office to meet up at the entrance, I turned around, and one of those sets of eyes was almost at the ceiling," she added. Mark and I turned to face her and noticed that she was visibly shaken up from the recollection. "Once more," she continued. "I like to imagine that it was just my mind playing tricks or something, but there was nothing at that height that a rodent could have been sitting on for that to make sense. It was just a wall, and once I began approaching it with the lamp, it went right back down to the desk in an instant," she included. Mark and I glanced at each other, but otherwise remained silent. Despite the surreal nature of that description, it evidently matched what each of us had experienced as well. We didn't directly mention it, but something about that structure just wasn't right. It was a conclusion each of us appeared to silently arrive at as we quickened our pace and exited from the opening. The other 6 members of the crew were eagerly waiting, as our arrival was met by multiple lights shining through the hole. They looked marginally on edge as well, but before either party could exchange information, the sound of thundering footsteps from within the facility grabbed our attention. We returned the beams of our lamps to the opening, though were unable to immediately spot anything due to the freshly disturbed dust, further limiting the visibility. Eventually, the footsteps were evidently originating from within the warehouse. As a shadow became visible, it was Davy, in a degree of full sprint that was virtually impossible for someone in that age bracket. Angus was soon behind, seeming to be clutching his arm. The light Davy was holding had clearly stopped working, and Angus had very clearly abandoned his at some point. Upon exiting the opening, Davy immediately signaled in the direction of the trucks and barked orders between raspy breaths. "Load up the fucking trucks." "We're leaving," he ordered. Angus was soon behind, and it became evident fairly quickly that he'd been significantly injured, with a stream of blood seeping between the fingers clutching his arm and pooling at his feet. Aside from the blood loss, he was pale as a ghost and speechless, with his eyes wide with shock. For someone of his stature, it was beyond abnormal to see him in such a state of abject horror. In fact, many of us genuinely assumed it was impossible. Without question, all of us sprinted towards the trucks, quickly loading them up and starting them as we left the site. Being a passenger in the vehicle with Davy, I turned to him and immediately noticed his expression being one of pure and unadulterated fear as well. "What the fuck happened in there? Where's Al?" I quietly asked. Sensing the gravity of the situation, Davy shook his head and clutched the steering wheel even harder as he turned to me. "Al is fucking dead. Finn, those weren't rats, and whatever they are tore him to shreds," he silently replied, before returning his eyes to the path before us. "What was left of him we could barely even identify," he added, his voice shaking. The sound of tires on stone once more enveloped the air, as both I and the two other crew that had hopped in the passenger cab were unable to formulate a proper response. Eventually we reached an intersection with 3 narrow tunnels, and Davy quickly turned into the one leading to the surface. Soon thereafter, however, Davy's radio crackled to life with Margot's voice emerging from the device. "We're missing a truck. They were falling behind and didn't make the turn," she commented, the urgency in her voice indicating that Angus had conveyed the situation to them as well. We looked in the rearview mirror and noticed that we were in fact 1 truck short. Despite 4 having left the site, there were now only 3 in the single-file line of vehicles. Davy slammed the steering wheel and released a string of obscenities before turning the vehicle around. He rolled down the window and ordered that the remaining trucks stay put as we traversed the short distance back to the entrance of the tunnel. Upon arriving, we turned back towards the site only to see a rather unwelcome sight. Half the length of the shaft was now submerged in complete darkness. The strings of lights illuminating the cavern walls and ceiling to the very end had evidently failed, with the portable work lights along the nearest half of the cavern being the only source of light. Even the ones nearest to the site had begun to flicker, with a large floodlight stationed along the wall opposite to us, failing rather shortly upon our arrival. As within the facility, the remaining lights reflected off various sets of eyes at the edge of the darkness, some at ground level, others seemingly 20 feet or more in the air. There seemed to be dozens of them, and as another set of work lights extinguished themselves, I could have almost sworn that more sets of eyes appeared. Aside from the occasional popping of the lights, it was eerily dead silent. Most notably, the remaining truck wasn't anywhere in sight, having evidently broken down far beyond what was now the reach of the light. Furthermore, nobody within that vehicle had been present in that facility, meaning the full urgency of the situation was likely not understood by any of them. Davy, likely realizing this, loudly called out to them, his voice cracking while doing so. Upon receiving no response, he yelled once more, his voice echoing across the cavern walls. Again, there was no response. For a moment we sat in silence, awaiting any sign that the occupants of the truck were still there, only for more silence to follow. Eventually more work lights popped, with the line of darkness now becoming precariously close. Davy once more released a stream of obscenities before grabbing his lamp and rushing to the edge of the light, shining it across the cavern from left to right. The various sets of eyes seemed to avoid the light, shifting to remain outside of the direct beam, filling the air with an unnerving scuttling noise as they did so. Eventually, the beam reflected off the white paint of a truck at the furthest wall of the cavern, with the doors visibly open. The light likewise reflected off a mound lying directly outside of the door, which to our horror, we quickly identified as one of the reflective stripes on our high-visibility work jackets. The jacket was evidently still attached to something solid, but the spacing between the visibility stripes indicated that it was no longer in a single piece. Nearly on cue, Davy's work lamp began flickering once more, He quickly took notice and sprinted back to the well-lit area as it extinguished itself. Without a word, we once more loaded into the vehicle and began making our way back through the narrow tunnel. However, just as we were approaching the remaining 2 trucks, ours began slowing down, eventually coming to a complete stop. Davy attempted to restart it to no avail, with a gauge on the dash indicating that the battery, with supposedly enough juice to last all shift, had already been completely depleted. Without any hesitation, we exited the truck and sprinted to reconvene with the rest of the crew, each of them now outside of their vehicles as well. Mark, being in the last truck of the group, immediately noticed us returning without the 3 missing members of our crew and leaned against the side of the truck with his head in his hands. Angus was likewise standing nearby and now had a blood-soaked t-shirt wrapped around his arm. Margot had the hood of one of the vehicles open and eventually slammed it shut in clear defeat. She made her way over to us, as did the rest of the crew, and shared further unfortunate news. The battery on both trucks is completely drained. Tried to radio back to the surface, but the units aren't working either, she commented, the weight of the situation likewise becoming evident to those still somewhat unaware. Silence filled the air for a brief moment before the faint sound of another bulb popping drew our attention. We turned to face the entrance of the tunnel and noticed that the cavern outside the entrance was now completely black. Similarly, the lights nearest to the entrance had begun to flicker, as were the ones directly above us. Davy quickly sprung into action and retrieved a folded piece of paper from the glove box of the nearest vehicle. After unfolding the large sheet on the hood, he scanned it with his finger before signaling the rest of us over. The paper before us was a map of the caverns, with Davy pointing to a spot midway through the tunnel ahead of us. That's the closest rescue chamber. We can't hoof it all the way to the surface, but the chamber is sturdy and has supplies. We should at least be able to wait it out in there and call for some help, he stated. Everyone unanimously agreed, and we quickly retrieved functioning lamps from the back of the nearest truck before beginning to jog as a group through the tunnel. Angus was in the back of the group, and I fell behind to run alongside him. His condition was noticeably quite rough, though adrenaline alone would almost certainly keep him going until we were relatively safe. Though I hesitated initially, I eventually implored as to what had happened within that facility. What the fuck went down in there? I quietly asked between breaths. He was silent for a moment, then eventually answered, "They fucking got Al. Lol. Tore him limb from limb," he weakly replied, pausing for a moment. The room was full of them, and I barely had a chance to back out of the doorway before my light died. He added, pausing for another moment as he grabbed his arm and winced in pain. Once the room went dark, something lunged at me, ripped a fat chunk out of my arm. If Davy hadn't rushed over with his lamp, they would have got me as well, he commented, once more going silent. I likewise went silent, returning my focus to the pathway ahead. For a while, nothing but the sound of echoing footsteps filled the air, along with the faint popping of lights in the distance. After another 5 minutes of running, I checked behind us and noticed that the darkness had expanded well beyond the entrance of the tunnel. In fact, it nearly seemed to be keeping pace with us, as only around 200 feet of the tunnel was sufficiently lit behind us. Davy similarly checked behind us at around the same time and took notice of this, picking up his pace as he encouraged the rest of us to do the same. "Almost there. Let's pick up the pace," he loudly stated between breaths. Exhaustion and an audible sense of fear were becoming evident in his voice, as it shook with each word. Knowing him quite well, along with his generally blunt and unexpressive mannerisms, it was an unnerving thing to notice. The rest of the crew similarly seemed to pick up on this, as the collective pace increased to a sprint. Eventually, a sign became visible on the ceiling ahead, with an arrow pointing towards an opening in the right of the tunnel. Upon reaching it, we were greeted by a welcoming sight. The reinforced steel chassis of the rescue chamber with a small light above the door signifying that it was in complete working order. Without a second of hesitation, Davy and Margot reached the heavy door and collectively opened it. One by one, the remaining crew filed inside, taking a seat on the long benches on either side of the capsule. I followed, as did Davy and Margot once everyone was inside. Upon closing and securing the heavy door, Davy likewise collapsed onto the bench, placing his face in his hands and going silent. For 10 minutes nobody spoke a word. The chamber was cramped, and any noise would noticeably echo within, but nothing aside from our bated breaths could be heard. Eventually, the unwelcome sound of bulbs shattering became faintly audible through the door, initially seeming a slight distance away, only to soon be fairly close. As the sound began to reach the tunnel directly outside the door, Margot silently stood up, verifying that the door was properly secured before once more sitting down. The sound of bulbs shattering passed by the outside of the door, and then slowly faded as it continued through the remaining stretch of the tunnel. The overhead light within the chamber began to flicker, and then subsequently dimmed, though it remained on. Shortly thereafter, another sound became very faintly audible, the sound of something hard, such as nails, lightly scratching and tapping on the outside of the chamber. It started out relatively unnoticeable, but quickly escalated in both frequency and volume until it was all that could be heard. It came from the walls, door, and ceiling, and echoed throughout the inside of the chamber at a deafening frequency. Angus covered his ears and began sobbing, while the remaining crew was very visibly barely keeping it together. To our delight, however, the light remained functional despite having dimmed by a large margin. In fact, most of the remaining electronics within the chamber appeared at least slightly functional, something likely permitted due to the immensely thick steel construction of its exterior. After around half an hour, the sound faded, and silence once more filled the room. After a moment, Davy quietly stood up and began tinkering with the radio, with it thankfully still functioning and allowing connectivity with the surface. Upon explaining the situation, management informed us that a rescue team would be en route shortly, but was currently delayed due to site-wide equipment problems. Explanations of the things down here with us fell on deaf ears, as the individual surface side simply attributed our accounts to oxygen deprivation-induced hallucinations and suggested that we activate the chamber air supply. No amount of convincing from the rest of the crew could change their mind, and we eventually had to simply concede and hope for the best, both for our safety and that of the individuals being sent to rescue us. Conclusively, that brings us to the present as I write this. Multiple tablets were discovered in a supply locker, connected to the company extranet, with a thankfully significant amount of power still contained in each. Each crew member took turns contacting loved ones, along with informing the families of those who perished of their fate. Once I had done the same, I took it upon myself to construct this account in order to spread awareness of the events that transpired today. We've been in this rescue chamber for well over 5 hours at this point, and there hasn't been any additional word from the rescue team or the surface. We're trying to conserve as much battery as possible, so I'll go ahead and end this here. I'll attempt to upload this in various areas online to get maximum coverage, but the extranet is painfully slow, so it could take a while for anything to post. If there's any major updates, or we somehow make it out, I'll provide additional updates as necessary. If you happen to have come across this, thanks for reading, and wish us luck. We're clearly going to need it. Story 2. We walked along the train tracks. I can hear the cans rattling around in George's bag. I looked up to Jet, who was cautiously pointing his bow, loaded with an arrow around, ready to shoot it if needed. I feel a slow calm come over me. At least I have a small group now. I remember when I was alone in the beginning, those weeks of being stranded in my apartment were the most alone I had ever felt in my entire life. I look over to a very wary Jet and smiled. Finding a random person had changed that, making my odds to survive whatever hell we were living in that much stronger. See, I'm pretty sure my little town was the only place on Earth that had zombies. At first, I thought it was the entire world, but no, it was just us. We knew we had been left stranded by the government a long time ago, only waiting and biding out time until it finally ran out, until we became one of those things too. I remembered how it had felt. Back then, in the beginning. I stared up at my ceiling. The screams outside kept waking me up. It had been a few weeks since my personal hell had started. I guess technically it was everyone's personal hell. Half the population had to be dead already. Or was it undead already? I sneer at the idea. I don't know. I don't know how to feel. Why am I even thinking about this? I hear a crash and loud stomping feet above me. Must be my neighbor above me getting attacked. I need to leave. I was running low on supplies. I look over to my last 2 granola bars and 3 chip bags. The dim lighting of the night moon shining through my curtains and onto the snacks, like they were on display for the last food preserved on Earth. I sigh. I had no more clean water. This was a disaster through and through. I'm going to fight like hell till the very miserable end. I will not die without a fight. I hear more struggling and screaming above me. I feel my conviction resurface. I slowly close my eyes, forcing myself to sleep. A giant bang at my door was my alarm clock. I shot up, reaching for my kitchen knife, holding it at the ready, watching my door shake with the force of whatever was behind it. I can feel myself shaking, but if I wanted to survive this, I had to stay calm. Then, my worst nightmare happened. The door came crashing in, swinging off of its hinges, knocking over my desk and cabinet in the process. A giant man-zombie stood there. I felt my shaking hands quivering and sweating, the blade slowly falling from my nervous grip. This was how it was going to end. I made eye contact with the bloodshot red eyes of the giant man. He opened his grotesque mouth of blood and sharp teeth with his missing tongue. Then he screams at me like I'm the problem. I suddenly think back to hugging my mom gently and her patting my back. Another flicker of a memory of me playing games with my friends online, laughing and telling bedtime horror stories. I feel a single tear come out of my right eye. This is it, the end of my short-lived life. I can't help but wish for more. More memories, more time. Just more. The man lunges at me, and I tear the bed sheets off of me, pulling them into a ball to push between the two of us. He slams into me, laying me out on the floor, all grit and muscle on top of me, with only a layer of thick bed sheets in between us. I was full on crying now. I felt like a sad loser, but I couldn't give up. I had to make this count. I readjusted my grip on the knife, and with as much force as I could, I shoved it upwards into the skull of the monster. Down came a paw of blood and other parts that should be neatly tucked into a human face, not falling all over mine's. I closed my eyes and mouth, trying to not let it seep into any part of me. I shoved and shoved until the big man rolled over and fell onto the ground beside me. Thankfully, he was unmoving. The strong urge to barf hit me hard in my gut, and I did just that all over my attacker. I wish I hadn't. I had just threw up the last of my food for at least a week. I was officially running on E, and I hoped that if I were going to be eaten the next couple of days, it went quickly. I got up. I could still feel my legs wobbling unsteadily. I grabbed my last food snacks and shoved them into a carry-away bag. I grabbed a small water filter I had from Boy Scouts years ago, and a canister in case I found some water. I grabbed my only 2 weapons, a kitchen knife and a baseball bat. I put the knife in my bag holster. I'm alone. I looked around my old apartment. I know I won't be if I leave. There's more out there. There has to be. I'm really going to miss this place and the fun I had. My college friends were amazing. The amount of nights I had spent just hanging out with them and eating pizza, the thought saddens me. I walk out cautiously. Apparently not cautious enough, because one of them must have spotted me. It comes running down the hall. I run as fast as I can, heading down the flights of stairs. I lived on the 2nd story. Thankfully, the stairwell wasn't that long, but the hinges were broken on most of the doors, and it just kept running at me. I needed to hide. I still had that guy's face juices all over me. I think back to an old zombie movie I watched once where someone put zombie blood all over them to try and blend in. I'm not sure if that will actually work or not. Maybe I just needed more of their juices. Gross, why am I even thinking about this? I run over to a gate and hop it, seeing no way forward, only to look back and see the zombie use the unhinged door next to the gate. Why didn't I see that? Gosh, I need my calm back. I feel my panic set in, as I'm almost met in the face with an arrow. If it hadn't been for a slight slip of my feet, I would have been a goner. I looked up and saw a man holding a bow and arrow, shooting with precision. Except I wasn't sure if he was shooting at me or the zombie. I dodged the other 3 arrows tearing through the air, and all 3 hit the zombie head-on. I heard the man say headshots all day. I would have laughed if I weren't freaked out by being chased and being shot at. I looked back at the fallen zombie and then back to the curly-haired man with green eyes. "Hey, dude, did I scare you?" I look up. I guess he wasn't trying to shoot at me. He sounded pretty friendly. "Yes," I state as he started to laugh, waving me over. I remember how happy I was to be talking to someone after 3 weeks of being alone. "You okay? You're staring a lot." I look away from Jet and up at George, our newest companion. He doesn't seem very fond of me. Maybe it's because he realizes I have a giant man crush on his best friend. Or maybe he was a rich snob from the get-go. It's really hard to tell sometimes. Though I actually think he might just be hiding something. I really want to find out what. I'm not staring. George moves over to Jet and whispers in his ear. "Stop." Jet laughs like he thinks George is being absurd. I bet he is too. We make it to our destination basically unharmed. You see, we get internet reception still. We can browse the internet. We even get electricity still. For some reason, they hadn't turned any of that off. I could watch and post as much as I won't. But that was only a one-way street. Almost like a firewall was in place for this town. I couldn't receive messages. I could only send them. Though it seemed like the government could care less about our water, that was turned off a while ago. We've been blending all kinds of fruits to take their water, putting out buckets for when it rained. The whole 9 yards, anything to maintain positive water levels. Then I think back to our windmill farm. On second thought, it might have been the windmills still giving us power. Either way, when we got inside to our hideout, we checked for creatures, and when we found none, we got to getting comfortable. Or as comfortable as you can get while also still being on guard, lest something tries to attack. I walked over to Jet, who was Saturday swinging his feet off of the top of the balcony. We looked down at the beautiful nature all around us. We were in some kind of inn, or at least the remnants of one. "Hey, how are you this fine morning?" I say, pretending to put on a country accent. He side-eyed me. I would have been fine if I hadn't heard that horrible accent. He laughed. I let a quick nose snort out. Then I joined him on the balcony edge. "See anything yet?" He nodded towards something. I looked over and saw 2 of those zombies sprawled out on the floor by some bushes. "Great shot." I smiled. "Yeah," he said, trailing off. "Hey, Bouncios, do you want some cheese?" Came a Povish accented voice. We both looked back to see George holding up some very ripe cheese. Oh, gross. I could smell it before he was even out the door. Jet put his hand over his face, covering his nose. "Come on, I heard this kind of cheese is supposed to stink, and it tastes better the more aged it is." I looked to what George was holding. It was a white slab of cheese that looked almost like a cake. "Wait, isn't that cheese supposed to be carefully taken care of with a temperature-controlled room and with proper air ventilation?" said Jet. Like it was obvious. He nodded at Jet. It was in proper conditions, it wasn't even touched. Still Saturday, under the same situation, which I'm assuming was the proper way to take care of it. George looked back to it, like it could solve all of our issues. "I'm all good." I said. They looked at me. "Me too," said Jet. "Fine, I'll try some," George said, as he stuck his finger in the cheese, pulling out some of it. Then he pulled it to his nose, smelled it, licked it, and then he ate it. I choked at the sight. "Gross, dude." He started choking and coughing, and he held his throat. Me and Jet immediately got up, running over. "Are you okay?" "What's happening?" Followed by stupid laughter from George. "I got you. You guys thought I was dying from cheese poisoning. How moronic." I rolled my eyes, walking back over to my perch. Jet laughed and then somehow got talked into smelling and eating some of the cheese. He declared it delicious, but stinky. I nodded as the 2 continued eating the cheese. "Wow, that's disgusting." I walked over. "Give me some." George held it towards me, giving it over. "If we're all going to be poisoned and die, then at least we'll do it together," I said. Jet smiled. I'm guessing he was happy that George and I seemed to be getting better at not hating each other. Honestly, I wasn't entirely sure that issue wasn't over with just yet. I put my finger in and scooped out some cheese. I smelt it, coughed at the smell. I have no idea why I smelt it. Like the smell would be any better than it was before. I licked it, but I didn't taste anything. Then I plopped it in my mouth and began to chew. I flouncy up as the sour dairy taste hit me. Gross, it tastes like old sour cream. But I could totally live through the taste. I kept eating and then swallowed. I looked at the other two, and they just stared back, looking for confirmation. It's not too bad. It looks like we had found our dinner. Of course, we would regret it soon after. A lot of bathroom goes, 7 rolls of toilet paper and a towel. Later, we were all Saturday around groaning every 2 minutes. It was worth it, said George in the corner. I felt a pang come up from my butt to my stomach. No, it totally wasn't, I said, groaning. I heard Jet let out a groan from outside on the deck as I heard the ending scream of a zombie and the sound of his bow. Never a dull day, huh? I say, looking to George. No, especially not with you around. He almost sounded accepting of me. Even though a few days ago I'm fairly certain he gave me a thinly veiled threat about being Jet's friend and staying too close to him. I sighed at the memory. Can't you do something that's not incredibly stupid? Said George, sprinting beside me. No. I can't hear you. Oh. Real mature me and George are running from the thing behind us, while Jet gives us cover from up above in the house. Just hurry up and stop nagging Grandma, I say sarcastically and out of breath. Well, it wouldn't be chasing us if you hadn't dropped a can that loudly. It slipped. I heard a dramatic gasp. It did not. You literally threw it into the bag filled with other cans. Were you expecting it to sound like a feather? Sorry to break it to you, but a can on can sounds like a heavy metal band. Please, George, not while we're being chased by a monster. Fine, gosh, I hope all rich people aren't this annoying. I wipe my face of sweat and throw my cargo bag over the fence. I grab onto the hinges and lunge myself over, falling on the dirt hard. I hear George land before me. I immediately scramble up and grab my bag and keep my fast-paced run up. I hear the screeching coming closer, and then a loud, dying hush as the creature finally goes down at Jet's arrow's expense. I run to the door and hold it open for George as we rush in. I immediately get to locking and binding the door, huffing like a madman. What are you? An idiot. I look up at George, shaking his head at me like he couldn't believe my existence. I said I was sorry, I wasn't expecting it to be so loud. Okay. He storms off, dropping his cargo. I sigh heavily and shake my head, trying to let the air flow back into my nostrils. I hear footsteps approaching. I look up into green eyes. What made George so mad? I roll my eyes at the mention of George's name. That guy has been a pain ever since he showed up. To top it all off, Jet seems to have some weird soft spot for him too. I sour at the thought. He's got his rich pantaloons in a twist, I say sarcastically. I see Jet make a confused and cautious face. Yeah, he says it like he didn't know he was speaking. I sigh again. He looks me in the eyes, carefully watching me like I was a scared animal. I sure felt like one. I hated being chased by those things. It always made me panicked for days after. I couldn't tell Jet that, but I'm pretty sure he could tell somehow anyways. I felt like I couldn't really ever hide anything from him. It's one of the main reasons I regarded him as a close friend with a lot of respect. You okay? I shake my head, yes. But I can feel my palms quivering. He looks down at them and then back up at me. He slowly walks over, putting his bow on his side strap. He holds his arms open for a hug, and I silently accept, feeling a large warmth engulf me as I slowly close my eyes. I know the world has gone to hell outside, but at least I had a friend, someone who cared. The hug deepens when we put our heads on each other's shoulders as he rubs my back comfortingly. It's okay. We're all okay. I smile in contempt at the words. We pull apart and look each other in the eyes. He smiles at me. I can tell he was just trying to comfort me. Hey, I see an angry-looking George in the corner. We both look over. Jet walks over to the forgotten cargo on the floor, getting some cans out and ready for dinner. Hey, yourself, said Jet snarkily. George looked less angry than before. I wonder what his beef was with me. Very clever, said George, folding his arm. Jet laughs softly. Let's eat corn, boys, says Jet like that wasn't last night, or the night before that's meal. I shake my head as he walks off carrying a bag of food and random junk that we could consider our snacks. George looks at me with annoyance written all over his face. How's it going? He looks like he wants to ignore me. You're real buddy-buddy with Jet, aren't you? I shake my head, yes. Annoyed already. Yeah, we did just spend majority of a year in an apocalypse together, I say sarcastically. I see George's eyes twitch and a sigh. Well, back off now, he says like he was chastising a dog. Excuse me. I say, you may be. I rolled my eyes. Why is he being so sassy? Why are you acting like I'm the bad person here? He looks up with a downturned snarl like an upset kid. I just was alone for a better part of a year in an apocalypse. I'm going to miss my best friend, okay? I say, trying to make it obvious that Jet was both of our friends. We look at each other with snarls. Hey, we hear from the kitchen. Can one of y'all come over here and help set up a second pot for beans? George looked over in the direction that Jet was. I'm coming. We looked back at each other. Why does this feel so annoying? I rolled my eyes as he walked out. Maybe it's because Jet seems like he likes George more than me. I was the runt of the group after all, the youngest. Jet sometimes treated me like an overprotective brother or mother. It all kind of depends on the situation. Later on that night came the threat. I remember being Saturday around the fireplace, doing a night watch when, would you ever give him the opportunity? George looks back over to me. No, I rolled my eyes. This guy was all talk, no play. Why? Was it because he was a narcissist? I don't care what he says, I can't trust anyone. Is he the exception? I stare at George's angry expression. Yes. George had woken up in the middle of the night, during my watch shift, to tell me he didn't trust me. I feel like me and Jet have known each other forever, even though we only met during the apocalypse. Yet his bestie feels cold and angry. The complete opposite of Jet. Which I guess is what I was like in the beginning of this all too. Cold and angry. Scared and sad. You know, all of the usual stuff. I shift at Jet's soft snore that makes me look back at his sleeping face. He slept on peacefully while the vibes in the room turned more and more wrong. It's commendable, I think, how you've turned him into a pile of putty. I look back up into intense dark eyes. There was a sense of vengeance in those eyes, like I had done something wrong and I will be slain for it. Putty? What do you mean? His accent feels a bit sinister when he talks all vague like this. He was always a workaholic, a hard ass, a stubborn guy. He stops abruptly, shaking his head like he didn't get where he was going with this. What I'm trying to say is, he's hugging you and comforting you like he's known you all his life, and I find it despicable. I furrow my brow because what is he even talking about? Despicable? Why exactly? You did something, didn't you, to make him act like that to a complete stranger? I thought he was smarter than that. To trust some random, to let them in, to be so weak. He shook his head like he thought Jet's decisions were dumb. Well, excuse me, but I'd consider us pretty close. I've known him for the entire year. What do you think we were doing during that? Twiddling our fingers. We're friends. Ha! He laughs obnoxiously. I hear Jet shift a bit, as if this guy is in denial, like a guy that didn't get his favorite toy at the shop. Let him be, I'm so tired. I sigh. Since you're up, do you want to start your watch shift so I can sleep? He looks a bit annoyed. Fine, go nap. I'll watch over. No, I didn't trust him, but I also was incredibly tired. The next problem will show its face soon enough. I sighed, remembering how my last thought had been of my life before. Well, I look over to George. He managed to not get us dead, so that's a win in my book. I still didn't trust the guy as far as I could throw him. Story 3. I think I'm being punished for what I did. Maybe I deserve what's happening to me. Most people will think so, but why don't I deserve a second chance? Is what I did so bad? I know a guy named Andy. We've worked in the same business for over 10 years now, and he's always been a schlub like me until the last few months. He was always a little overweight, had thinning hair, and deteriorating ambitions that come with middle age. He was in that nice, comfortable rut where you're making just enough money to look down on most people. But somewhere in the back of his mind was a little voice that told him that he was meant for more. I'm the same way. As the years go by, that voice gets weaker and weaker. Time devours everyone's dreams. And like most people, Andy and I both were actively feeding it from our own hands. Spiritual suicide. One day that changed for Andy. He came into the office and something was different. Everyone could tell that something had changed, but no one was able to put their finger on what exactly it was. He was always the nicest guy, but he was always a little melancholy. I think that's what I noticed first. He seemed truly happy. That first day, he made one trade. He took more money than he should have, and put all his eggs in that one basket. The next day, out of nowhere, he tripled that account. He did that over and over again for a month. He started to look better, not younger, just better. He lost the weight. His eyes were no longer tired but bright, and he was always reading or spouting off some kind of obscure but interesting thing he had just learned. He had a spring in his step and a power to his speech that just made everyone who happened to talk to him feel better. He had been in that office for so many years that he had faded into the background and became no more remarkable than the fake plants that decorated so many of the offices. But then, over a period of a week, he became everyone's favorite person. Fucking Flanders. Everyone and everything was attracted to him, including money. His wife would come by the office every once in a while, and she seemed to have gone through the same change. I fucking hated how happy they looked. One night I came home to my wife and looked around our house. An empty husk with staged family photos of kids who no longer talked to me, long dead pets, and a time-ravaged wife who I resented for sticking with a fucking loser like me. My existence was hollow. Midway through dinner, I got up without a word and walked to my office while my wife asked me what was wrong. Everything. You, me, the kids, my fucking life, everything. Was that me talking? I wonder about it now. How much of the horrible things I've done were actually me. I got a hotel that night, and for the third time since I've been married, I paid for sex. It wasn't something I'm proud of, but I thought it would make me feel better, more vigorous and youthful somehow. It didn't. Andy, can I take you out to lunch today? I've really got a problem and I'm hoping you can help me fix it. It was the best way to try and get him alone. He gave me that new stupid smile he always had on his face and agreed. I was lost and I needed help. I talked with him over 2 plates of outrageously priced pasta for an hour. I asked him what his secret was in every way possible, but he just kept saying it was clean living. I kept pressing and pressing to no avail, just the same new age shit. Andy, I've been diagnosed with cancer. I'm not looking for a cure, but I would like to live out the rest of my life having tried something different. Seriously, I need whatever the hell it is you've got. I want to have a few good years with Helen and my kids. I didn't give a shit about my wife. I didn't give a shit about my kids. I didn't have cancer. What I had was a fucking boring life and a fucking brilliant knack for lying. I also had a face that was able to sell whatever bullshit I was spewing, and that moron fell for it just like I knew that he would. He pushed his plate to the side and leaned closer over the table. In that dimly lit Italian restaurant, my life changed forever. Would you believe it if I told you that you might not really be you? That you've passively given consent over the years to living a life that you don't have to live? What the fuck does that mean? He frowned at the profanity. Like, what if the world over years and years poisons all of us with all the garbage we consume? Like there's something in us that feeds off of all that junk and just grows and grows until we just give up any fight we had in us because something in our brains tells us that it would be better to just give in. My wife gave me a secret. She had been going through an inspiring change, and I fell in love with her all over again. Everything about her changed, not just the outside superficial stuff. It's like she got back a lot of that stuff I remembered about her from high school, that spark. She started asking me questions, getting me to think about who I really was. My lying face was interested, but inside I was rolling my metaphorical eyes. He went on and on about his fucking wife and the fucking kids that they never had because they were both too busy with jobs that didn't really mean anything. I wanted to tell him that kids weren't all that they were cracked up to be. Mine were a couple of dream and time vacuums with voracious appetites. When she thought I was ready to hear it, she finally told me this little secret that she had stumbled onto. A friend of hers gave her a couple of pills. Drugs. Kind of. I'm not really sure what they are. I'm only allowed to tell one person about this, and if what you're telling me is true, maybe I can help you more than you know. What do you mean? Maybe it can help with the cancer. I forced my eyes to well up. There's nothing more pathetic than a man who is on the verge of crying and holding it back to look stoic. Andy Flanders ate it up and even reached across the table to grab hold of one of my hands. I'm gonna help you. Bingo. The next day, Andy gave me 2 small pills. Take these tonight. Rent a hotel room and grab a bunch of fast food. Something really bad for you. Take one before you eat, and one about a half an hour after you're done. This is important. You need to do this exactly as I'm telling you, and there is a risk. What risk? You need to be alone with no chance of someone around. Once you take these, you'll be in pain for a little while, but if anyone else is around, they won't be safe. If you're being honest with me about everything, then it's going to be painful, but you'll be okay. If you're not being honest with me, it could go really bad. Way beyond bad, actually. You are being honest, aren't you? Andy, I've never been more honest with anyone than I have been with you the last couple of days. He smiled that stupid smile and clapped my shoulder. Tomorrow, everything is going to be different for you. Call me tomorrow and I'll tell you what happens next. Later that night, I did everything he told me, up until a certain point. I had rented a hotel room and got 2 bags of 5 Guys. I looked at the pills, and I stopped before I even started. I began to wonder what could go bad. Why did he have to be so damn cryptic? He didn't mention death or anything, but I wondered what might happen. It didn't take me long to figure out I couldn't go through with it without knowing the consequences. And it didn't take me long to figure out what the next step was. I hardly spent any effort asking Helen to forgive me. She had always been easy. She always forgives me, and maybe that's where some of the resentment came from. She had already eaten. So I opened a bottle of wine and crushed up the first pill and poured it into her glass. I needed to make sure the pills were safe for me to take. I didn't feel comfortable taking them in some hotel room where if something went wrong, no one would know. I thought if anything terrible did happen to Helen, I'd be there to make sure that she got help right away. If something great happened to her, then I would simply tell Andy that I needed another couple of pills to give to my wife, and then take them myself. It was a win. Win. I watched her for 30 minutes and nothing about her changed. I let her drone on and on about things we could do to make our lives better, knowing full well that if everything went to plan with these pills, I would leave her regardless of the positive effects that they might have on her. I was hoping for a whole new life. Why would I start it with the woman who fucked up the previous one? That's what I thought. Anyway, another glass and the other pill. It was a long night of listening to her talk. We finished 2 bottles before she was ready for bed, and nothing had changed about her whatsoever. On one hand, I was relieved that nothing bad would have happened to me had I taken the pills. But on the other, I was furious that no change seemed to occur at all. I fell asleep next to her after telling her multiple times that I wasn't in the mood for sex. I remember the smell woke me up before the wetness did. Then I heard Helen groan and vomit. She ran for the bathroom, spewing out of both ends. I got up to watch. She was sitting on the toilet and vomiting into the wastebasket. Oh my God, my stomach. Don't come in here. She kicked the door closed before she heaved again. Helen, what do you want me to do? Nothing. Just try and clean up the bed, please. Okay. I stripped the bed and I was gagging at the smell of everything that was on the sheets. Some of it was on my leg, and even though I wanted to stay to hear what was going on, I ran to the spare bathroom to wash it off. I hurried back as quickly as I could, and I heard the shower. Helen, Helen. After a moment, I opened the door and saw that she had climbed into the shower. The bathroom floor was slick with everything that had come out of her. I'm so sick. Do I have food poisoning? Do you want me to call a doctor? No, I'm just sick. Her face was bright red, and her nightgown was plastered to her body. I remember feeling more relief than guilt. I thought she was going to be okay, but I was determined to get back at Andy for what he did. God, my insides are all in knots. I remembered that he had told me that it would be painful, but it seemed to be going quickly for Helen. Whatever the hell it was doing. She stood up and exhaled loudly. This is embarrassing. I'm okay. Don't be embarrassed, honey. It's okay. I turned toward the bed and thought to myself that we were going to have to sleep in one of the guest bedrooms. There was no cleaning our mattress. That's when I heard Helen scream. When I turned, she was looking down. Something long and black was squirming down her leg, and it was coming out of her backside. Oh my God, Jeffrey. She slipped in the tub and fell down. Before she could say another word, or I could grab my phone, more things began to crawl out of her. They were like thin black worms that whipped about in agony, springing out from inside of her. Dying things looking for something to hold on to. She was screaming, and I was standing there in shock. It happened so quickly. The worms writhed in the bottom of the tub, finding nothing to grasp, and then they extended upwards. Finding a grip on the safety bar, they contracted and became thicker. The safety bar groaned as the tile that it was attached to began to give. A thick, fleshy mass attached to the end of the worms spilled out of my wife and slopped onto the surface of the soiled tub. Helen kicked it as she got to her feet and staggered out of the bathroom. It made a painful sound that I can't possibly explain, like some beast crying out underwater. She collapsed next to me, and I held her while we watched it thrash and cry inside the tub. What the hell is that thing? I couldn't say anything. I just stared at it as it convulsed in the tub. The arms were extending and jerking into the air, slapping against the shower walls. Andy's words ran in my mind. Like there's something in us that feeds off of all that junk, and just grows and grows, until we just give up any fight we had in us because something controlling our brains tells us that it would be better to just give in. It's some kind of parasite. Helen looked up at me. What? Andy. Andy gave me some pills. Andy Tackett. Yeah. I was stunned, shocked. I should have shut up. I wasn't thinking. He said something about things growing inside of us, and then he gave me pills to get rid of it. I just wanted to know that they worked, that it wasn't some kind of trick. What did you do? Nothing. I was still watching the thing dying in the tub. The water from the shower was pelting its leathery skin and began to make sucking noises against the wet porcelain. Did you give me some kind of pills? Why would you do that to me? I looked down at her, and before I could even say anything else, I felt something wrap around my ankle. It started to burn. Helen pushed away from me, and Crab walked across the floor backwards as fast as she could, while those worms extended out of the tub. It felt like thick rubber bands were tightening around my leg. I tried to crawl away, but my head felt heavy, and there was a warmth spreading upwards from where the worms were squeezing against me. All my limbs were jelly, and I felt like something was taking over my brain, inside my mind. I couldn't scream. It was drugging me. Helen was standing a good distance away from me, and her face was a mask of horror while the thing slowly pulled itself out of the tub and undulated across the bedroom floor. Helen ran out of the room while it began to crawl inside of me. Its muscles were contracting and relaxing and contracting again as it squeezed inside and upwards through my guts. I blacked out. The next morning, I felt sick. All the mess was still there. But Helen was gone. I tried to call her cell, but she wouldn't pick up. I called an ambulance. I obviously couldn't tell them what happened, but I needed help. I told them I had severe stomach pains and I felt like I was dying. Several tests were run, and I insisted on an X-ray. Nothing was found. Just like Helen, whatever it was that had crawled inside of me was gone. I felt relief, but I had never felt so sick in my life. I stayed home for a few days. Andy came by the house on the 4th day. He wouldn't come inside. Andy, I need help. The The doctors say there's nothing there, but I feel terrible. You should. They'll never find them. But there's 2 of them inside of you now. They're going to be fighting each other to feed. I need the pills. Andy, if you had done what I said, the one inside of you would have died without a host. I need the pills. That's not how it works. I was only allowed to give it to one person. Now Helen has the choice of who she helps. Andy, please help me. She's doing fine, by the way, in case you're interested. Helen, she talked to you. That night, she came to our house. We explained everything to her. You know, the things you didn't explain before you gave her pills that were meant for you. How could you do that to your wife? She's better now, though. Right. That's not the point. You could have taken them yourself, and then explained everything to her so she could make that decision for herself. I don't know how long you've got carrying 2 of them. You better pray that your wife forgives you. She has children she could help instead of you. He turned and left me. Helen hasn't forgiven me, or spoken to me. My health is declining, and I finally broke down and explained to a couple of doctors what happened. They think I'm crazy. I know there's only one way to get better. If there's anyone out there reading this who went through something similar, please reach out to me. I need help. I don't know how long I have. I'm so sorry for everything I've done my entire life. Somebody help me. Story 4. Two years ago, I lost my dad. I don't think he's dead. At least not necessarily. I think it's best I tell you exactly what happened. Maybe then you can give me a solution to the deepening pit of anxiety and guilt within me. My dad reminisced about his hometown a lot. He told me and my sister about how he was an only child raised by traditional parents, and how he would stay outdoors from dawn till dusk, playing with his friends in the woods. His best friend Luke would accompany him on scout missions to the limestone quarry at the center. They'd watch from the upper ring, laying on their bellies, peering down into the spiraling void, sharing a pair of binoculars with one of their eyes each in the adjacent lens, only to be spotted shortly after and chased off the site by security. He was still annoyed about that fact, balling his fists or talking himself out of breath whenever he got to that part in the story. My mum told us about how she met my dad at a summer camp, and how he fell head over heels for her confessing his love after only meeting for a day. Giggling, my mom gave him her family's landline number, which my dad called every day, leaving messages complimenting her or asking about her day. They fell just as hard as each other since they married after a year of dating. This was after my dad's world shattered. He told me and my sister that my grandparents died in a freak accident, as the detective put it. My dad was too young to comprehend the whole thing, and not alone figure out what to do with his inheritance. He never told me and my sister how our grandparents died. I suspected he didn't know. I suspected that he rather wanted to move on and start a new life with my mom than wallow in his own tears in an empty house. They were happy. We were happy. But I think it ate away at him all those years, wondering what happened. It wasn't any surprise that when his childhood home made an appearance in a documentary about abandoned towns, we paid a visit. Why are we going back? Well, that documentary ignited a memory in me that I had long forgotten. There's a time capsule in the woods that me and Luke buried when we were younger. I don't know. I guess just seeing it on the TV like that made me realize that it would never see the light of day again. I think it's only right we're the ones to do it. You'll get to see where your old man came from. He chuckled, punching me lightly on the arm. Say, why do you think this place was abandoned to begin with? The documentary didn't really make much sense. Well, if I had to guess, I suppose it has something to do with the quarry. Limestone isn't as in high demand as it used to be. Suppose it just went bust, and with funding being cut off from the rest of the town, younger folk probably lost hope and left. Good luck convincing your elders that. They likely stayed, and the town dwindled down over time to what it is today. A ghost town? What do you think? I thought about his answer for a while, watching the golden wheat fields passing us by. I couldn't argue with him, and I told him that I agreed, punching him back on the arm. It was quiet most of the way, with my mum and sister deciding to stay home. But my dad liked to break the silence every now and again, cranking up the radio and singing along at full volume as we barreled down the dirt road. After 10 hours, we finally passed the welcome sign of Woodburn. My dad's eyes glazed over. Any semblance of excitement or joy of coming back and leaving with it, as the grey wheat stalks came into view. Cracks littered the dry soil, intertwining in hexagonal shapes like that of a fish's scales. The grey clouds rolling overhead, a light downpour of rain, plastered the car's windscreen as we neared the first row of houses, the dense greenery growing larger in the distance. Opposed to the evident signs of drought, the wheat field endured. The village itself had become a botany hive mind. The front lawns were significantly overgrown to the extent that plants began to grow along the side of the house and across the road, leaving natural potholes as they tunneled beneath the tarmac. The plants will be getting a nice drink. My dad chimed, trying to bring the atmosphere back to normal as the rain started to pick up. The low hum of the engine was the background music to our scouting mission as we crawled through the streets, taking our time to avoid the stray roots that tunneled beneath the road. As we turned the third corner, a car came into view, held in mid-flip by thick veins that knotted around themselves, enhancing the thickness to an impossible scale that seemingly attempted to prevent the car from crashing down on a patch of newly sprouted stems. Impressive what plants can do when left on their own, ain't it? I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat as we slowly passed the wreck. Continuing down the street, we turned onto a road that passed along the town square. The engine suddenly cut out, with my dad clutching the keys in his hand as he stepped out of the car. You kidding me?
Alex gets out here.
It's the town hall. I stepped out of the car, my dad already skipping over to the building without waiting for me. Slowly following him, I was rooted to the spot, taking in the spectacle before me, a Gothic masterpiece made entirely out of limestone, arches and pillars failing not to make the viewer think of the architectural genius of the Roman Empire, now long forgotten with the earth taking it back. Vines wrapped tightly around each of the pillars, leaving fissures and cracks for more to take root, with the arrow-headed leaves making it appear as if the building underwent a siege. As I entered the building, I found my dad already rummaging in a stack of drawers, taking out papers and pens and examining them eagerly. The vines had already gained entry to the interior, wrapping around the wooden chairs, leaving some suspended and twisted in the air. This isn't what caught my attention. However, written on the board at the center of the stage were the crossed-out words, fire, chemical, blockage with the uncrossed word, manual, beneath them. Hey, Dad, what's that? I said, pointing at the stage. My dad turned his head, following my finger, locking eyes with the words, with a confused look across his face before taking a short intake of breath to scoff. It's probably a last-ditch effort to revitalize the quarry. Some sort of training program. I didn't quite agree with him, but with no argument to suggest otherwise or opinion of my own, I lightly shook my head, which he took as a sign of respect, as a smile beamed across his face. Come on, let's get that time capsule. We're not far now. Brushing past my shoulder, his footsteps echoing around the room as I turned to follow him. Left, straight, right, and then another sharp left turn straight in the middle of a path, as my dad turned to face a thick bramble of leaves and thorns. Smiling, he began folding and twisting his body around the branches, scraping his arms a couple of times, with a light trickle of blood forming at the back of his arms. I stood hesitantly observing the path he created, vaguely making out the blue sign, public footpath, lodged within. Breathing a heavy sigh, I embraced the orchestra of yelps and moans, advancing in pursuit of the rose-tinted memories my dad held on to. By the time I made it through, he was already on his hands and knees, scraping away fistfuls of soil, revealing a large tangle of intermingled root systems beneath that were shown no mercy as he yanked and severed their connections. Burying his hands further, his elbows mere centimeters from being submerged, he finally revealed a small black box as he began dusting away the grit with his hands. Alex, come look at this. he shouted in pure excitement, his laughter bellowing out through the trees. He opened the box, rifling through countless pictures of him and his friends, holding them up to me for my approval before burying his face back into the box, taking out figurines and playing cards. "Pretty cool, Dad," I said almost mockingly. You wouldn't get it. This stuff is rare these days, if you had any idea. Hello. Both spinning around in the dirt, we stood face to face with a teenage girl who looked around my age. She had short, curly brown hair with a few stray leaves, which had become caught, making it look like a bird's nest. She wore a blue flannel shirt and skinny jeans, both caked in mud, along with her brown boots, which had become worn down by the rough terrain as leaves and stems hung aloft the many tiers. "You scared us," my dad laughed breathlessly. "Are you from Woodburn too?" The girl slowly nodded, the leaves bouncing a little with the sudden movement. "Us too. We're just stopping by so I can show my son where I came from," he said, patting my shoulder reassuringly. The woman didn't respond as she continued staring at us with her green, gloopy eyes. My dad went to speak before a rustle of leaves came from behind, averting our attention to our newest intruder. Mom!" My dad froze, sweat trickling down his forehead, his legs shaking. An elderly woman emerged from the leaves wearing a white cardigan, brown trousers, and green wellies showing the same evident signs of wear and tear as the other women. Her pale, thin skin stretched tight across her bones, her pulsing veins stuck out prominently, the sunlight above making them appear a light green. She began stepping towards my dad, her arms outstretched, ready to embrace him. My dad, on the other hand, was a puddle of snot and tears, his constant trembling causing the box in his hands to rattle unendingly. Only a foot away from us now. The tightness of her skin around her skull had become more visible, each shadow further sinking her features as they started to ripple and contort too, her parting lips as long, thick vines plummeted out of her mouth, entwining themselves, with the roots below pulling her face down to the earth as she endeavored to advance. Her speed unfaltering, the vines were pulled tight against the roots as her skin began to tear, the dark red flesh poking from beneath, only to be overcome by more and more vines, snapping out from her unhinged jaw, releasing a putrid stench that stung my eyes, making my head spin until I couldn't take it and vomited directly onto her. My heart was racing, my eyes bulging. My mouth felt sapped of moisture as I lost control of my body, and my legs took me further into the woods, the screams of my father echoing behind. Tears streamed down my face, blinding my vision. I tore through a bramble of thorns, skidding across the gravel and rolling to a stop just before the edge. Wiping my eyes, my heart pounding in my ears, my stomach sank as I gazed out at the open quarry, its many levels spiraling down to a bottomless void. My hand shooting up to cover my nose, the smell of rot and spoiled vegetables invaded my senses as I spun my head, blindly looking for the source. Slumped against a tree trunk was a thick entanglement of vines and leaves, the wet bone jutting out from within. The vines had completely taken over their body, twisting themselves into a dizzying effect, replacing the spilled-out intestines as more saplings took root, pinning them to the ground as buds started to flower across the protruding ribcage into a thick array of petals that dug into their sockets in an explosion of vibrant colors. I gagged and heaved at the sight, my body unable to find anything else to throw up. Stumbling to my knees, I knocked something, sending it skidding across the gravel, my head raising to see as a plastic blue miner's helmet come into view. I couldn't take it. People say that you don't know whether you're a flight, or freeze until you have faced a situation where your mind physically can't comprehend what you are seeing and senses immediate danger. I'm flight. A cowardly waste of space that left his dad in that place with those things. I ran and I ran, and I ran stumbling over branches and vines and roots. I didn't come across anyone else in those woods. When I made it back to civilization, I came across some friendly strangers willing to lend a hand. I made a report to rescue services about my dad, and they told me they conducted an aerial search, but that they couldn't see anything through the greenery. They told me countless times that they were looking, but I knew they were all lies. I think they knew what had taken over that town, and they were too ashamed to accept responsibility. And who am I to judge? I ran away from my dad. I think about him a lot, especially now. This morning I came across something in my garden. I came across the arrow-headed leaves of that god-forsaken town. I don't know what to do, and I'm terrified. I tried digging it up, but it came back tonight, and it's grown even more. I've been sitting on this one for a little while, but I think it's time. This happened about 3 years ago. I was, without a doubt, the worst kind of hiker. You know, those guys who would all leave no sign, bagging their garbage, burying their poop, cleaning up their campsite, respecting nature's natural beauty, and all that. Yeah, that wasn't me. I like camping. My parents liked camping, but there was always a mentality of the woods will take care of things. I watched my dad leave a whole cooler full of empty beer cans at the site one time when I was 8. We brought a couch with us on a camping trip once just because Dad knew there was a ravine nearby. Broken fishing rods, left by the creek. Garbage, right on the ground. Hell, we left a whole tent once because Dad couldn't get it back in the bag. We didn't use campgrounds either. Dad and Mom would pack up and find somewhere in the middle of nowhere and just live off the land for a couple of days, and then leave their crap behind. I can't say that this is why I am the way I am. I know better than to litter and be a pig. But in my head, the woods will always just take care of themselves. It's been here for millions of years. Why is my trash and stuff going to mess with that? If my styrofoam cooler kills a couple of trees, then they didn't deserve to be there. Right. That was what I thought, at least. I go camping about 3 times a year. The start of spring, the start of summer, and the end of summer. I live in California, so I always just pack up my pickup, get some food and beer and recreational greenery, and head out to somewhere remote. A buddy of mine from work hadn't shut up about this overlook about an hour from the city, right outside the Santa Lucia mountain range, and I figured I'd go crash out there for a weekend. Unlike my parents, I am not a living off the land kind of person. I brought food, I brought stuff, and I intended to do nothing but sit in the wilderness, sleep in my hammock, and get high. I called out Friday and found the perfect spot by lunchtime. It was gorgeous, overlooking the valley and so remote that if I were to get really hurt, I'd probably die out here with no one the wiser. I set up my hammock, set out my fire logs, got some water, just in case, and just kind of spread out a bit. I made some lunch, sandwiches, rolled a joint, and just kind of got mellow for a bit as the day rolled on. It was nice out here, just watching the clouds and listening to nature. I was soon pretty well lit, and as the sun started creeping down, I set about lighting my fire. There was probably a burn ban in effect, but I had water and I didn't care. Out here, no one was going to see me anyway, and I started roasting hot dogs as the sun cut a fantastic line across the sky. That was the first time I noticed them. I remember looking up and whispering shit as I mistook them for rangers or cops or something. They were just silhouettes on the ridge not far from my camp, 3 or 4 of them, and they had these wide, flat-topped hats like park rangers or the guy on the oatmeal box. I watched them for a minute, thinking I was busted, but they just stood there. They didn't move. They didn't call out. But I know they saw me. My fire had to be visible for a ways at this height, and the longer they stayed there, the more creeped out I felt. Why were they just standing there? If they wanted me to leave, then why not tell me to leave? I didn't know, but once the sun set, I noticed they had vanished and just kind of kept an eye peeled. I had my gun, a big old .45, so I wasn't worried, but I suddenly wished I had a tent to sleep in instead of just a hammock. I sparked up again after eating a pack of dogs, though, and that took care of any thoughts of shadow guys or whatever. I dozed off in my hammock, but I dreamed about them that night too. I dreamed that they were in my campsite, just standing around and watching me. They were like the outlines of people, Like when someone stands in front of the sun and all you get is a burnt-out image of them. They didn't have any features, no eyes or anything, and I was frownsome there as they looked at me. They didn't say anything. They just watched me, and it felt like being sleep paralyzed the whole night. I woke up after dawn, almost fell out of my hammock, and started making breakfast as I stirred up the ashes of last night's fire. I wondered if it had really been a dream or not, but I felt like it must have been. Why would they come and look but not say anything? All my stuff was there, too, down to the hot dog wrapper I'd left on the ground next to the fire, and I tossed it in absent-mindedly as I ate my eggs and ham. The ice was still holding out. It was spring and not too hot yet, so I decided to go on a forest pub crawl today. Translation: I put a bunch of beer into my backpack and walked out into the woods so I could have a drunk hike. I spent about 5 hours hiking in the woods, tossing my dead soldiers into the trees as I finished them. Some of them broke. Most of them didn't. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me as I hiked in the woods. I never saw anything. It wasn't like I spotted someone hiding behind a tree, but it was like deep pockets of shadow that shouldn't have been there. It was midday. The sun was high, and I should have had major visibility. Even so, I found myself looking around as the crawling feeling just got worse and worse. Some of it was being drunk in the hot woods with no water, and when I found a stream, I plunged my face in to get a little clarity. I drank a little. Dad always said running water was fine to drink from, and when something snapped not far from me, I looked up like a zebra at a watering hole. I looked around, trying to find what was stalking me. There was nothing, just the quiet forest and the gently rushing stream. No, I didn't believe that. I had felt stalked all day, and as I watched the trees, I felt sure that something moved out there. I got up and started running, the zebra analogy too hard to break, and I kept waiting for the claws to sink in, the teeth to bite, and the hot breath to fall on my neck. It was going to come at any minute. I could feel it. And when I tripped over a fallen log, I just lay there and waited for the end. It would get me now. It would get me and I'd be dead. I'd be dead. Nothing happened. I lay there for nearly 10 minutes, just knowing it would get me when I moved. But it never came. When the ants started to bite my legs, I sat up and swiped at them. I had fallen next to an ant bed that I had accidentally stomped on in my haste, and they were mad as hell about it. I ended up going back to the creek to wash them off, a haphazard trip that took another 10 minutes, and I was still looking around like a scared animal. I sat with my legs in the creek until they stopped throbbing, and then made my miserable way back to camp. It was not as much fun walking back as it had been walking out, and I was jittery and tense the whole way. The sun was starting to slip down, and I absolutely didn't want to be out here when it got dark. Too many things could be crunching around out here in the dark. I made it back to camp before it got dark, and as I cooked my dinner, the sun started to ride low again. It was more hot dogs tonight, cooked over the fire, but I couldn't finish all of them. I was too scared to look away from the ridge, and I ended up burning more than one of them. They tasted fine either way, but I had eyes only for the shadows on the ridge. They had the same wide-brimmed hats. A few of them had canes, but none of them were really people. They were like shadows. The burned images at Hiroshima, the photo negatives that sometimes get burned into old photographs. All of them at once, and none of them at all. They just stood there, watching me. They didn't move. They didn't stir. And as the sun sank, I became colder and colder. I should have gone to my truck and left. But I didn't. I made myself put it out of my mind. I convinced myself that I was being foolish. When it got dark, I got in my hammock and tried to get comfortable, but it wouldn't come. My leg hurt. I was sunburnt. I was hungover. I was dehydrated. But ultimately I was afraid. I was afraid that when I closed my eyes, they would get me. I was afraid they would just carry me off in the night and I would never be seen again. They would find my truck and my campsite, but never me. Maybe, I thought as I finally nodded off, someone would look up one afternoon at sunset and see me on that ridge, just watching. I must have fallen asleep, and I like to think I dreamed what came next. I want to, but I can't convince myself that I did. I woke up and saw them standing around me. I could see them, and not just the ones in front of the fire. They were darker than the night somehow, and they began to creep closer to me. Crept is the wrong word, though. They slid along the ground like the ghosts in some of the horror movies I'd watched as a kid. They hemmed me in, my body shaking but my voice stuck in my throat. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare speak. And as they knelt around me, I heard whispering. It was a terrible sound, and it follows me into sleep sometimes. You come here to the womb of creation and leave your waste. You are a brainless creature fit only to destroy things made by your betters. You burn the wood of a creature who has existed before you were more than a twinkling in your father's eye. You destroy a place that was new when this planet cooled. You throw your trash into a home shared by 100 billion organisms, and you claim to be the superior here, the better. You are nothing, and you will die and be forgotten. On and on and on. They whispered endlessly to me, telling me how worthless I was, how I was a nuisance and a nothing, and how I would never change. Then, one of them rose up over my hammock, his body seeming to hang over me like a shadow cast from above. He looked like them, but he was clearly their boss or something. And when he brought the cane down on nothing but air, I heard it crack like a thunderbolt. Go back to your stinking pit, but be warned. The next time you come to our woods and ruin our place, you will not be allowed to scamper off so easily. You are a stunted thing who was taught badly, but ignorance is forgivable if you persist in this folly. However, we will not be so kind again. No, go, it yelled, and I opened my eyes to find that it was morning. I was laying in my hammock, piss dribbling down my leg, and I knew that I'd better not be here when the sun set again. I cleaned up everything. I picked up all my garbage. I cleaned up the site. I poured water over the fire and mixed it with dirt like they always say to on TV. And then I took everything with me and ran for the truck. That was Sunday, and I've been kind of afraid to leave my apartment. What if they are waiting out there for me? What if they find me slipping or don't like that I don't recycle or something like that? What if I offend them and they drag me back to the woods to be punished? That's part of why I'm writing this. If you're like me, someone who doesn't care about their mess or just leaves the woods wrecked, then watch out. Don't let the Dark Watchers catch you messing up their forest, because they do more than just watch. Don't let them see you slipping, or you might find out what sort of punishment awaits those who anger them. Story 5. I'm about to start my senior year of college. Last semester I took a job as a desk attendant at my school's library. It's a private university, so they get away with paying their workers below minimum wage, but I don't mind. So long as I make enough to be able to afford my gas, I'm in the clear. I commute about an hour back and forth from home to school every day of the week, so a little gas money goes a long way. The cool thing about the library job is that it doesn't require much from me. I sit at a desk and check books in and out, answer the occasional phone call, and help wherever needed. I have a lot of downtime and spend most of it reading or catching up on homework. Hours are a little sporadic though. My schedule usually looks something like this. Tuesday 2 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. Thursday 4:30 p.m. to 10. The library closes at 10. I spend many of those hours doing nothing at all, really. Being in the library for so long with nothing to do, you begin to take notice of certain things, like when the library is most active and when there's no one in there at all. It's fairly active towards the start of my shift around 4:30 and dies down from about 5:30 to 7. From 7 to 9 there's usually a good deal of traffic in and out. More often than not though, I spend that last hour from 9 to 10 completely alone there. Those nights when I'm there until close, I'm responsible for shutting the lights off and locking the room downstairs that houses the library's book collection. I'm never down there during the day. Most of the textbook students need to check out are kept upstairs and are never more than a few steps away from my desk. Locking that room is the last thing I do before I go home for the night. I took this job because I wanted something on campus where I could walk straight from class to work. The last thing I want to do is leave school and have to drive somewhere else to go do more work. So having that job right there on campus was ideal. It is incredibly mundane, but I get to see a lot of faces. It's nice to know that people on campus don't just see me as that weird guy in their economics class, but rather that guy in the library. Like I said, from about 9 to 10 it's pretty quiet in there. Most of the other lights in the building are usually already turned off before I even leave. One night when I went to lock up the room downstairs, I thought I heard something coming from one of the back corners. I called out, asking if anyone was down there, and when no one replied, I shut the lights off, waited a beat to see if someone yelled out, "Hey, I'm down here," or something. But when no one did, I locked the door and closed it behind me. I didn't dwell on it at all. In fact, I put the whole thing completely out of my mind almost immediately. I only remembered it again after what happened to me recently. Another great thing about this library job is that it continues into the summer. My friends hound me endlessly about staying on for the summer. Why don't you just get a job in town, they say. Something that's not an hour away and pays better. I don't want a different job though. I like working there. I like being on campus when no one else is. There's a strange feeling to it, but it's one I like. It makes me feel like a true staff member there and not just some student worker. The job is different over the summer though. Since there's no students coming in to check out books, there's really no need to just sit at the desk upstairs. Lots of other libraries request books from us. So the first part of my workday involves packaging up those books for shipment. It's a long, complicated process, and it usually takes most of the morning. Once that is done, however, the summer project has been to go down to the book collection and make sure all the books are still there. There's a huge list, all on an Excel spreadsheet, every book in the entire library. And my job is to go through and check every single one to make sure that it's there and catalogued properly. If a book isn't there, I type an X next to it in the Excel sheet and move on. Lots of books that are shelved aren't even on the list. Those books, I turn onto their spine and my boss comes through later and takes them out. I don't work alone though. There's another girl that works with me. We each take a section and start on either end, checking off books until we meet in the middle. Once we're done, we move on to the next section and start the process again. The collection is large enough that oftentimes starting on either end of one section means that she and I are several shelves away from one another. Summer hours are different too. I work from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. Wednesdays and Fridays. I get Saturday through Monday off, which is pretty nice. One day, when work was about over, I came back upstairs from the collection and remarked casually to my boss that I found a book down there from the 1890s. She didn't seem as thrilled as me about the discovery. "Go wash your hands," she said. I was a little confused. "Why's that?" I asked. In books from before 1900, they used to use heavy metals like lead and mercury in the publishing process. I attended a conference a while back and they talked about that. I'm doing my best to take all of those books out and get rid of them. Go wash your hands. I went and washed my hands in the bathroom, and while I was in there, I couldn't help but realize the tragedy of what she had said. She was going to be getting rid of any old books she found. It's not that these books were all that interesting, usually some old treatise on bird watching or something like that. But still, old books are cool, poisonous or not, and I hated to see them going into the dump. Most days down in the book collection, it's my boss, my one co-worker, and myself. We often talk back and forth from across the room about strange books we find, calling out goofy titles and things of the like. I occasionally find an old book from the late 1800s and tell my boss. She snatches them up and puts them on her card. I hate seeing that, so I have taken to just not telling her about them. Summertime temperatures are in full swing, so most days it's about 90 degrees or so outside. Problem is, it's about 60 degrees down in that book collection room, so I always have on a sweater or something over my t-shirt. When I step outside to go to lunch, it's always incredibly too hot for all the clothes I have on. But if I didn't have them, I'd freeze to death down in that book collection. When my boss told me that my co-worker would be gone for the next 2 weeks, I didn't think much of it. It was an easy job, and all her absence meant was that it would just take a little longer to get through sections of books now. Lots of times I was down in that room by myself. My boss was often in her office or running various errands around campus, I always knew when she came back down there because I could hear her begin scanning books and putting them on her cart. Though I hardly ever saw her, I'd occasionally catch a glimpse of her between shelves of books. I always bring earbuds because without some kind of podcast or music playing, 4 hours or so in that collection would just drive me insane. I came into work the other day, 15 minutes late, 10 minutes later than usual, and noticed that my boss was not at her usual place behind her desk. I took my seat at my desk and saw a note stuck to the computer screen. "Good morning. I will be out of town today and tomorrow, Thursday and Friday. If you run into any issues with loans or anything, don't worry about it. We will figure it out next week. Have a great weekend." Reading this note, I honestly breathed a sigh of relief. Now I could slack off and not feel bad about it. It's not that I hate this job, but it's not exactly easy to lock in and work when all you are doing is reading call numbers on books and putting a little check mark or an X on a spreadsheet. I did my best to get all the loans taken care of for that day and immediately took advantage of my boss's absence. Anytime I want a drink when I'm working, I have to walk to a separate building nearby where there is a vending machine. It takes roughly 5 or 6 minutes to get from the library to the vending machine and back. That building with the vending machine is one of the oldest still standing on campus. Even in broad daylight, it gives me the creeps. I got a drink and took the long way back to the library. I was probably gone for about 10 minutes. I went down to the book collection, put my headphones in, and picked up from where I left off the day before. I was at the very back of the library, the farthest corner from the door. Back there, one of the overhead fluorescent lights is out, so it's oddly dark. Having just got back from that creepy old building, I was already somewhat spooked when I got back down to the book collection. Like I said, that room is always cold, but that day it felt even colder. I genuinely felt like my sweater and sweatpants were not enough to keep me warm. The longer I was down there, the more I wished I had a jacket, or a thicker sweater or something. I made the mistake of listening to a creepy podcast that day. This was a podcast I always listened to while working down there. But today, all alone, in that cold, poorly lit library, I realized that it was a mistake. I periodically took my headphones out because I swore I heard something. Each time I was proven to be incorrect, thankfully. I wondered for a while if the air conditioning in the building was broken or something. I could not think of any other reason why it was so cold in the book collection compared to the rest of the building, and especially outside. When I went out for lunch that day, I was genuinely shocked by the temperature discrepancy. I had to take my sweater off before I even got to my car. If you have ever been in a garage or an old basement in the winter, then you'd have a pretty good idea of what it felt like in that book collection. Getting back from lunch, I resumed my work. And yes, that same creepy podcast. As time ticked away down there, I suddenly got an overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. I couldn't see or hear anyone else down there, but I felt it strongly. I set my laptop down and walked around the room, checking every aisle of bookshelves. I looked through all of the windows to see if anyone might have been outside, but there was no one. I was still completely alone. I began to long for the workday to be over. I wanted to go home. I had gotten spooked, and at that point there was no getting unspooked. I checked my phone and saw that it was 3 o'clock. I was relieved. Only 1 hour left. I went back to my work, but I soon became aware of some kind of sound. I pulled one of my earbuds out and listened. It was some kind of humming. I couldn't tell if it was from a machine or from a person. That collection room of the library contains a lot of doors that are always locked, with little signs that say things like boiler room or mechanical room. I figured this humming, which I had not heard at all this summer, must be coming from one of those rooms, but even still it didn't do my nerves any favors. I left my earbuds out, turned off my podcast, and decided to finish that last hour of work in silence. After all, I was getting sick of pulling an earbud out every 5 minutes or so to check for some strange sound. I heard a book fall. It was plain as day and unmistakable. Somewhere, several shelves away from me, a book just fell off of a shelf and hit the floor. That's got to be a pretty common thing in libraries though, right? I got up and looked for it. I saw it. It was one of those old books. It was so old that it wasn't even in English. I'm fairly certain that it was Latin. I picked up the book and put it back in place. I realized while reshelving it that it came from a very tightly packed shelf. I honestly had trouble squeezing it back into its place. Why would that book have fallen? It was almost like someone had tried to pick it off the shelf, dropped it, and ran away. But I knew that couldn't be what happened, because I would have heard all of that. But I didn't. All I heard was that book hitting the floor. I checked my phone and saw that it was only 3:07. How had only 7 minutes passed? I decided that I was done anyway. I needed to get out of that room. I was freezing, and I was scared. I shut my laptop and left. I hit the lights on my way out, and I know I heard another book fall before I closed the door. But I was not going to stick around to put it back. The whole drive home I thought of how ridiculous I was being. A book fell in a library. Big whoop. That's possibly the most normal thing that could happen in a library. I figured that I had just gotten spooked and had overreacted to everything. Fear has a way of heightening your senses. That must have been why I could hear every little noise in that library all day. I wondered if that humming I heard was something that is always going on, or something that kicks on periodically, and I just have never noticed before. By the time I got back home, I was laughing at myself for how paranoid I had been. I woke up late the next day. It was raining. Rolls of thunder kept me from getting up. It was so nice, so peaceful. When I actually looked at my phone and saw the time, that cloud of serenity dissipated. I jumped out of bed and quickly got dressed, rushed to my car, and sped out of my driveway. Halfway to the school, I realized that there was no reason for all this hurry. No one was there at work. When I arrived, I could be sure that I would be alone. A sinking feeling crept into my stomach at that realization. I thought of the day before. I was scared of my mind wandering again, elevating every little thing I heard or noticed. My fear was not of the library, but of what my own imagination would do to me while I was down there. I did not want it to happen again. I figured the more I thought about it, the more my imagination would mess with me. So when I actually got into work, I put my earbuds in and turned on some music. Most of the other people that work on campus must have had the day off that day, because it really felt like I was the only human being on the entire campus that day. It was so bad that I checked my schedule a few times just to make sure that I was in fact supposed to work that day. There was no mistake there. There were other cars in the parking lots, and some parked along the streets near the campus, but I really did not see anyone. I began the typical morning shtick, checking for loan requests and all that. There were none that day. That meant I had nothing more to do that day other than go down to that collection room and start checking books. The room loomed over my mind. My imagination had begun to have its way with it, but I quickly pulled myself back together. It's an old room in an old library. Of course it's going to be creepy. Of course the central air isn't going to work right down there. Books fall off of shelves. That just happens. It is fine. Get over it, I said to myself as I slowly crept down the stairs. I reached the final step and turned to look down the short hallway to the collection room door. It was still shut, just like I left it. I slowly walked over to it and opened the door. I had forgotten to shut one light off. There was a single fluorescent light panel illuminating a small part of the collection room. It was closer to the back of the room, surrounded on all sides by darkness. Simple and explainable, but there was just something about it. The sound the light made, the darkness surrounding it, the dull, yellowish nature of the light itself. My stomach sank immediately. I debated turning back right then, but instead chose to stay. I flicked the other light switches and the rest of the lights came on. It wasn't so bad like that. The sinking feeling in my stomach went away. It was as cold down there as it ever was, though it felt colder as my clothes and hair had not yet dried from my rainy walk from my car to the library. The clouds were dark enough that not much natural light got through the windows of that room. This left the corners dark and made the light feel unnatural. The upbeat music playing in my earbuds did only a passingly decent job at keeping my imagination from running wild. A few times, like the day before, I thought I heard something. At some point I remembered the book that had fallen before I closed up the day before. I wondered where that was and went looking for it. I walked between the shelves searching for the book. I never found it. I had heard a book fall, right? The sinking feeling came back a little bit. I returned to where I was, towards the back most part of the room, wary and growing increasingly more nervous. I felt as though the room was getting incrementally colder as the day went on. At one point I swear I saw my own breath. Suddenly my hair stood up on the back of my neck. I looked up from my laptop. I peeked through the shelves. Something was watching me and I knew it. I pulled my earbuds out and held perfectly still. I heard that same humming that I heard the day before. It seemed louder this time. I stepped away from my place in the shelves once again and began to walk down the aisles between the shelves. The humming did not seem like it was coming from one of those locked storage closets. Honestly, it didn't seem to have any source or point of origin at all. I found a strange spot on the ceiling in one of the aisles. I think that it was near the same shelf where the book had fallen. The spot looked like mold to me. It was black, but not faded or soaked in like how a lot of mold looks. It was dark black and almost shiny. It looked like someone had bought a paint can from Lowe's or Home Depot, opened the lid, and thrown it up at the ceiling. I understand that it must be mold or something, but I just don't think I've seen anything like it before. Another thing about that huge black spot. It was cold. Just standing below it, I felt like I was in a meat freezer. Perhaps just above that spot was where the central air was broken. I really don't know how that even works. Like maybe a pipe or tube was broken or ripped or something. Whatever it was, that explanation satisfied me enough. I walked back to the place where I was before and started working again. I found it incredibly hard to focus on my work. I wanted to leave. I was getting freaked out again, the same way I was yesterday. I was trying as hard as I could to keep my composure, not to become paranoid like I had before. I sat today on a stool staring straight ahead at the shelf of books in front of me. I wanted to ignore the feeling, but the longer I sat there, the harder it became. Something was looking at me. I could feel eyes on me. When I finally allowed the feeling to manifest fully, I felt paralyzed, as though whatever was looking at me could only sense motion or something. I heard a different sound, like the sound of something freezing or growing. It sounded like water soaking into a dry sponge. I seemed to perceive a dark shape hovering above me, but I couldn't bear to look up. I rationalized that a particularly dark rain cloud had passed close to the windows and blocked out even more of the Sunday. I heard a book fall again. I got up quickly. I grabbed my laptop and shut it, tucking it under my arm. I walked around until I found the book. It was that same old book that had fallen before. I knelt down to pick it up. As I stretched out my hand to pick up the book, I felt a hand touch my shoulder. The hair on my neck stood straight. My skin tightened around my muscles and became covered in goosebumps. Without turning around, I stood and began to run. I hit a sharp right turn at the end of that row of shelves, and another just a few shelves from that. Then I had a straight and clear path for the door. I could hear it, whatever it was. I heard footsteps behind me, not running, but footsteps nevertheless. As I neared the door, I reached out to shut off the lights. I hit the switch, and just before shutting the door, I dared turn and look behind me. In the darkness, I thought I saw a shape. Something terrible. Something tall. Its other qualities I could only speculate, though overall it appeared human-like. I slammed the door shut and ran out to my car. The moment the door slammed shut, I heard the thing scream. I will never forget that sound. I haven't gone back to work there. I've ignored the emails from my boss, which I started getting the week after the incident. After a few weeks, the emails from her stopped. I dreaded returning to school. I did all I could to avoid setting foot in that library. If I ever do have to be in there, I avoid the bottom floor. And even on the other floors, I keep it brief. I figured I would get a chewing out from my boss if she ever saw me again. The first time I saw her, though, I did not see disdain or anger in her eyes. What I saw was understanding, trauma, as though she knew why I had left and never come back. We did not talk, but rather shared this look of understanding. After this, I ventured to open the emails which she had sent me. I found in the first email confusion as to why I had not gone into work that day. The next email from a day later had more anger to it. Then there was the third email. It simply said, "I understand." Towards the end of that fall semester, one cool October day, I arrived at school to find the library closed. I saw men in hazmat suits going in and out of the building. When I got glimpses inside, I could see plastic covering everything. They told the students that there was black mold discovered in the library, and that considerable efforts were required to clean up and dispose of the mold. They also told us that the librarian had taken a job at another school and would not be returning. I never believed it. and the fact that the library never reopened only confirmed what I had thought. I've put as much detail into this as I could possibly remember, just in case anyone here has ever encountered anything similar. I've thought about it and was wondering if black mold exposure causes hallucinations or something. I don't want to believe what I saw down there that day, but I'm haunted by the memories. Memories too vivid to pretend like they are from a dream. But maybe if someone else had a similar experience or knows exactly what I was encountering down there, then perhaps I could feel some kind of closure about this whole thing.